January 25, 1945. The war was closing in on Germany from every direction, and Hitler made a shocking decision that would change the course of the Eastern Front forever. He appointed Heinrich Himmler, the feared leader of the SS, as commander of an entirely new fighting force called Army Group Vistula. Now, this might sound completely insane, and honestly, it kind of was. Himmler wasn't a military man. Sure, he'd served briefly in the army at the end of the First World War, barely making it to the rank of officer cadet. But that was it. He had no real battlefield experience, no training for commanding massive armies, and yet here he was, being handed one of the most critical missions of the entire war. But here's the thing. This wasn't Himmler's first rodeo in command. Just days before, he'd been leading Army Group Upper Rhine in the West during the famous Battle of the Bulge and its southern counterpart, Operation Nordwind, down in Alsace. Despite what most history books will tell you, Himmler actually pulled off some surprising wins. His officers, both from the regular army and the Waffen-SS, managed to push north of Strasbourg, expand the Colmar pocket, and even link up different defensive positions. These weren't huge victories, but they weren't the total disasters everyone expected either. So why did Hitler move him east? Politics, pure and simple. After someone tried to assassinate Hitler in July of 1944, the Führer started trusting his regular army generals less and less. He admired Himmler's ability to organize things, sure, but more importantly, Himmler was one of the few people Hitler still completely trusted. Everyone else in Germany feared him, which made him the perfect choice for a job that required absolute loyalty and ruthless determination. The mission Himmler faced was almost impossible. The Red Army was charging forward in their massive Vistula-Oder offensive, tearing through German defenses and racing toward the heart of Germany itself. Himmler's new Army Group Vistula had roughly 200,000 soldiers split into three armies. General Theodor Buss commanded the Ninth Army, holding the critical line along the Oder River. General Walter Weiss led the Second Army, stretched thin across a massive stretch from Elbing all the way west through Pomerania. And then there was the 11th SS Panzer Army under Felix Steiner, which honestly existed more on paper than in reality. Himmler had created it himself, probably hoping the impressive name would somehow make it stronger. Into this desperate situation stepped one of Germany's most legendary and controversial figures, Otto Skorzeny. You might know him as the tall Austrian commando with the distinctive scars across his face, the man who'd become famous for pulling off impossible missions for Hitler. Back in September 1943, he'd led the daring rescue of Benito Mussolini from a heavily guarded mountaintop prison using gliders and paratroopers, a mission that seemed straight out of an action movie. Then, during the Battle of the Bulge in December '44, he'd organized a special commando unit where German soldiers dressed up as Americans and snuck behind enemy lines to create chaos and confusion. Against all odds, they'd actually succeeded. Now, in late January '45, Skorzeny was at his castle headquarters north of Berlin when Himmler called with urgent orders. Soviet tanks and mechanized units were racing toward the Oder River, Germany's last major natural barrier before Berlin itself. Himmler needed Skorzeny to do the impossible again. Get to the town of Schwedt on the Oder River immediately. Bring whatever men you can find and establish a bridgehead. This bridgehead wasn't just about defense. Himmler was planning an ambitious counteroffensive to smash the Soviet spearhead and stop their drive toward the German capital. Skorzeny had limited resources, just 2 units he could deploy right away. His own Special Forces unit, the SS Jagdverband, numbered 680 men, and there was an SS paratrooper battalion with 689 soldiers stationed about 100 kilometers north of Berlin. He also had a few smaller support units, an armored company with half-tracks and armored cars, a sniper platoon of 40 men, and a heavy weapons company with powerful 15-centimeter guns. But Skorzeny was nothing if not fast. His first motorized troops rolled into Schwedt in the early morning hours of January 31st, and Skorzeny himself arrived at 7 in the morning. The town was still in German hands, which was good but barely defended, which was terrifying. Schwedt was crucial because it had 6 bridges spanning the Oder River and a canal, making it a vital crossing point. The Soviets were just a few miles away, and Skorzeny had maybe a handful of days to turn this town into a fortress. When he arrived, the local commander told him the grim truth. The only troops available were about 150 officer cadets who were there for an engineering course, and a battalion of Volkssturm, the home guard made up of older men and young boys, maybe 500 people total. That was it. But Skorzeny was resourceful and absolutely ruthless when he needed to be. He noticed that broken German units were constantly retreating through the town. Soldiers from divisions that had been smashed by the Soviets further east. These men were exhausted, demoralized, often leaderless, but they were still soldiers. Skorzeny ordered his paratroopers to literally collect these retreating men and set up what he called a battle school right there in town. The idea was to reorganize them, give them back their fighting spirit, and get them back into the line as quickly as possible. He also forced the local Nazi party leader to mobilize every able-bodied civilian in Schwedt to start digging defensive positions. Over 3 intense days, Skorzeny built his bridgehead from almost nothing. Himmler refused to send him proper artillery support, so Skorzeny improvised like crazy. He sent out foraging teams to scavenge whatever they could find. One group discovered 15 powerful 75mm anti-tank guns sitting in a factory 30 miles south of town and brought them back. They found 88mm flak guns, the famous German anti-aircraft weapons, and Skorzeny had them mounted on semi-track vehicles, instantly transforming them into devastating tank killers. His teams scrounged up more machine guns from local depots and abandoned positions. Meanwhile, his second-in-command, a paratrooper officer named Milius, started running aggressive patrols beyond the German lines. These weren't just reconnaissance missions. His paratroopers were actively hunting for Soviet soldiers to capture, interrogating them to learn about enemy positions, unit strengths, and attack plans. Milius set up his command post at Grabo, just northwest of Königsberg, and organized his defenses in layers. His 3rd paratrooper company dug in around Königsberg in a defensive half-circle. Between Grabo and a place called Königsneumark, his 2nd company formed another defensive line. His 1st company stretched along the east bank of the Oder River, covering the southern approach. Behind these frontline units, Skorzeny positioned his Volkssturm Home Guards, the makeshift army units formed from retreating soldiers, and his own SS Jagdverband commandos throughout Schwedt and the surrounding villages. Then reinforcements started trickling in. A battalion of tough dock workers from Hamburg arrived, experienced in hard labor and street fighting. Even Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command and head of the Luftwaffe, got involved. He was watching nervously from his luxurious estate north of Berlin, worried about the Soviets getting too close. When Skorzeny told him he needed more men, Göring immediately sent 600 soldiers from a newly formed battalion of his Hermann Göring Panzer Division. These weren't tank crews, though, just former Luftwaffe ground staff and airmen hastily retrained as infantry. Skorzeny took one look at them and immediately broke up the unit, distributing the men among his existing formations where they'd be more useful. Through sheer force of personality and ruthless efficiency, Skorzeny assembled an impressive force within just 1 week. He had several thousand men under his command, essentially a full division's worth of combat power, all centered on a bridgehead that extended about 4 kilometers from Schwedt. The position itself was naturally strong. The northern sector was protected by thick forests and the Wels River, making it difficult for the Soviets to attack with tanks. The southern sector had defensive trenches dug on hills that overlooked open ground, giving his defenders clear fields of fire. Skorzeny even ordered engineers to blow holes in the thick ice covering the Oder River, getting the water flowing again to create a more effective barrier. The Soviets would desperately want to capture Schwedt's bridges intact, so they could rush their armor across the Oder without having to wait for their engineering units to build new crossings. On February 6th, Major Lang arrived with 31 brand-new assault guns, giving Skorzeny some serious armored firepower. The first contact with Soviet forces came on February 1st, near Bad Schönfließ, about 25 kilometers east of Schwedt, when German reconnaissance patrols ran into Soviet advance units. As the Soviets pushed forward, the Volkssturm Battalion defending Königsberg completely fell apart and ran away, including their commanding officer, the town's mayor, a man named Kurt Flöter. On the morning of February 4th, Skorzeny returned to his command post and found Flöter waiting for him with excuses about the approaching Soviets, basically admitting that the town had fallen because everyone had panicked and fled. Skorzeny's response was swift and brutal. He decided that Flöter had deserted his post and caused his leaderless men to abandon their positions. Skorzeny had Flöter arrested, quickly tried by court-martial, and publicly hanged from a tree in the park right in front of the town's castle. A sign was placed around his neck that read, "I am Kurt Flöter, and I am hanging here because I deserted my town." The body was left hanging for 5 days, as a warning to anyone else who might think about running away. This caused a huge controversy. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful private secretary who controlled the Nazi Party throughout Germany, formally complained about Skorzeny's actions. Bormann even sent a high-ranking party official named Emil Sturz to reprimand Skorzeny for executing a party member without proper authorization. But Skorzeny stood his ground. He told Sturz coldly, "We tried your man not as a party official, but as a soldier. But aren't cowardice and desertion punishable in party leaders too?" Over the coming battle, Skorzeny would order about a dozen more executions of soldiers and civilians he deemed cowards or deserters. He believed this brutal discipline was necessary to hold together his mixed force of professionals, retreating survivors, old men, and teenage home guards. Late in the afternoon of February 4th, 1945, the real battle began. Soviet tanks from the 49th Guards Tank Brigade, the powerful T-34s that had helped turn the tide of the entire war, attacked the SS paratroopers' positions at Bernekow, just 2 kilometers east of Königsberg. The fury of combat had finally arrived at Skorzeny's doorstep. Would this hastily assembled collection of commandos, paratroopers, retreating soldiers, and desperate civilians be able to hold back the might of the Red Army? Could Himmler's ambitious dreams of a counteroffensive survive the crushing weight of Soviet armor and artillery? The fate of the Schwedt bridgehead, and perhaps Berlin itself, hung in the balance.